Okay, so what is social policy, right? So the Lisbon Treaty, which as you should all know by now is the latest one, is defines EU social policy as having as its objective the promotion of employment, improved living and working conditions, proper social protection, dialogue between management and labour, and the development of human resources with a view to lasting high employment and the combating of exclusion. Okay, so these are the basic objectives of EU social policy. Right, and one of the things that I will be showing you at the end of the lecture is actually how you can tie this in also to the job market. Right, you get jobs purely on this. Okay, it's a very important area of EU law because basically it covers a lot of employment law. Most employment law comes out of Europe. And if you know about employment law, you'll pretty much always have a job. Okay, so this is a very important area of law. Okay. Right. Okay, so again, according to the Lisbon Treaty, the Union and the Member States will have in mind fundamental social rights, such as those set out in the European Social Charter signed at Turin on the 18th of October 1961, and those rights set out in the 1989 Community Charter of the Fundamental Social Rights of Workers, which I'll be talking about a bit later on in the presentation. Now this all sounds very grand and very like, oh, isn't this good, right? But what we're going to look at now is, you know, when did an EU social policy start, and have the member states always been this committed to social policy? And the short answer is no, they haven't. Okay. So if we go back to the very beginning, so you should have all covered the different treaties. So what's the founding treaty? First treaty that set up the EU.
Treaty of Rome?
Yeah, Treaty of Rome. Okay, back in 1957. Okay, now you've got to put this in its historical context, right? The main reason that people decided to set up, right, the common market was basically to try and create a system where, you know, they were no longer going to be killing each other as they had been doing for 6 years. Europe was flattened. It was absolutely devastated. You had refugees by the millions, you had concentration camp survivors, you had major economic problems, that you had all the rebuilding to do. So in that context, right, they decided to set together and to build such a strong trade system that they could never go to war in the same way. And that's why they started off with the European Coal and Steel Community, because at that time, in order to wage war, you needed to have coal and steel. Okay? When they then went on to sign the Treaty of Rome, right, creating the common market, okay, they weren't really interested in social policy. They were interested in getting their countries back on their feet. Okay, and that was the main concern. But it was recognised even then that in order for the common market to work, basically workers had to be able to move around. So even back in 1957, there was still a recognition that, you know, in order for this to work, social rights are going to come in there somehow. So the main focus was economic, right, and dealing with these economic issues. And also social policy was a bit of a bone of contention, because even back then, right, in 1957, France already had principles of equal pay for men and women. Right, anyone here from France? No? Okay, all right. Good for France, okay. Yeah, so, and Germany didn't, and France was worried that if they didn't build in some element of social rights, that they were going to end up at an economic disadvantage. But when they were negotiating this, they didn't want to focus too much on social rights because they couldn't reach an agreement. However, there's always a however, right, the Treaty of Rome did say that if some measure of social policy was required to achieve an economic objective, then the Council could take action, but however, that required a unanimous vote in order for that to happen. And that's why, basically, between 1957 and 1987, which is when they had this unanimity thing, right, nothing happened, or very little happened, because there was always some country blocking it, and after the UK joined, it was usually the UK. Okay? So social policy was gridlocked for a number of years. Okay, now the European Commission, even back in those days, was quite creative and quite good about working its way round these problems. So one of the ways they did it was they actually said, social policy, we're not dealing with social policy, we're dealing with free movement here. This is a side effect of free movement, it's nothing to do with social policy. Okay? So what they tried to do was to abolish restrictions on workers, right? And create a system where workers could take their benefits with them no matter where they were in the EU, which at that time was obviously not very many countries anyway. And they also focused on preventing social discrimination in the member states to which they moved. But the main focus at this time was focusing on workers' rights. Okay, that's the main driver here. Okay, so between 1957 and 1987, right, progress was really slow. Nothing much happened because there was this requirement that everyone had to agree and nobody could get there were very few situations where they could actually reach agreement. So it was very much limited to focusing on workers, and that was the main driver. Directive 68/360 clarified the formal requirements relating to the rights of entry and residence of non-nationals. Right, this is non-nationals of that country, not non-EU nationals, because we haven't got that far yet. So non-nationals. So if I wanted to go and work in France, for example, like what rules would apply to me? Okay, and created a system of residence permits for EU nationals who were working in other member states. So it's still very much almost like a visa system. Right, you had to apply for permits, you couldn't just go, okay? So it's a rather different way of looking at it, but even so, even though there was still paperwork involved, the whole system was starting to open up bit by bit. Right? Other developments, 1979 saw a directive enacted which intended to prevent the discrimination of workers from other EC countries in national social security systems. Because even back then, they did recognise that if people couldn't take their social security systems with them, they weren't going to move. If you were going to lose your pension rights and everything else, you weren't going to move because it wouldn't be worth it economically. So you had to have a way of transporting these social security benefits no matter where you were working. Okay. Also in 1986, two more directives were passed which provided for equal treatment for men and women in the realm of occupational social security and self-employment. Okay, so what you're starting to get here back in 1986 is this concept of equal treatment, particularly equal treatment between men and women. Right, so this was now a slightly new category that was actually coming up, this concept of identifying that women were at a disadvantage, they weren't being treated the same, and that something ought to be done about this. So it's no longer limited to workers, but it's gradually being extended to also apply to women's rights as well, sort of gender equality. Right, and as time progressed, and as we got nearer to 1987, social issues were basically becoming a lot more important. Okay, and then in 1987, the Single European Act came in, which entailed the creation of the single market. my father worked for the Commission about that time, and I remember we came back to the UK about 1991 or something for a holiday. So we were living in Belgium at the time. And the guy at the border said to him, he said, "What's the purpose of your visit?" And my dad turned around to him and said, "That question has been debated in the European Parliament, and you do not have the right to ask me that question." And this guy said, "And who do you think you are?" And my dad turned around to him and said, "I'm one of the people who's getting rid of you in 1992. At which point they stripped the car, but there you go, that's another matter. Okay? So the Single European Act actually created the single market. So it was passed in 87, single market officially came to be a couple of years later. Okay? And one of the reasons that prompted this was people were saying, actually, if we operated as a single market, there was a huge commercial advantage. It was going to be worth billions to the countries. So that started to focus their minds on the benefits of sort of having, you know, some kind of social policy. And the other great advantage of the Single European Act is it was the first major revision of the Treaty of Rome, and they finally introduced qualified majority voting. Okay? So while the economy remained the primary concern for the revision, social policy was beginning to gain ground as an important issue for the future of the European Economic Community. Okay, so it's starting to get this awareness that these things actually matter. Okay, so qualified majority voting kicked in, and it applied to all sorts of things that it hadn't applied to before, like health and safety. I mean, I know sort of kids of your age, you've grown up with health and safety, and as far as you're concerned, it's a bit of a drag, right? But back then, it didn't even exist. I mean, like, if you got injured, well, tough, you know, that's just the way it was. So, you know, basically once qualified majority voting came in, suddenly countries were forced to accept rules which they might not even agree with. So long as the majority agreed with them, basically they had to go along with it. Okay? So before the Single European Act, there had been some health and safety legislation, but only basically if it was already in place in the member states concerned. So this is a new category now as well. So we've had workers, we've had women, and now we're getting workers and health and safety. Okay, so we're getting a development of the different areas where social policy is actually going to apply. Okay, and following the Single European Act, new measures were geared toward harmonising national social policy regimes. So that's special protection for workers who are pregnant, breastfeeding, as well as young workers. Right, so for example, there's something called the Young Workers Directive, and that was the directive that said, it was very contentious in the UK, young people couldn't work until they'd reached a certain age. So, you know, like probably when you guys were growing up, how old were you? What was the first job you had? Paper round, anybody? Yeah, so what age did you start working then? 15? Or older? 16, yeah. I mean, it's, before that, kids of 13 would quite happily work. Right, you do paper rounds, you do other stuff, right? And it was actually considered to be quite a good thing because it got kids involved in the world of work quite early. So this was fought very bitterly by the UK because they didn't want this. They said, we already have a system, we don't exploit young people, you know, and it gives them responsibility, etc., etc. But that came in and that was, again, a new area of social policy that applied to young workers as well. Women it was already applying to, but young workers was new. So the intention was to protect workers that were most likely to work in another member state and also that were most likely to be in certain sectors. So construction and services like tourism, you know, working in marine industry or that sort of thing. You know, basically services industries, hotels, that kind of thing. Another directive forced employers to notify their employees regarding intended changes to the employment relationship, right? Have all of you worked at some point? Yeah? Okay. So you know that if you go and you take a job, you get given a description of the terms of your employment, and you normally get a contract of employment. That's because of that. Right? It's not because your employer feels like it, it's actually because they're legally obliged. Okay? Another very contentious one was the Working Time Directive. Right? By law, you cannot work more than 48 hours. Right? And the normal limit is 40. Now, when this came out, the Working Time Directive, medical doctors and the like were originally exempt. And then a couple of years later, they actually passed the Working Time Directive as it applied to doctors. Doctors were doing 96 hours a week. Doctors were working for 2 days without sleeping. Now, call me old-fashioned, but when I go and see a doctor and I'm not well, I want him to be conscious and awake, right? Because otherwise there's not a lot of point me going. And the doctors were out on the streets in their thousands, right, saying, we want this. We are fed up of doing 96 hours a week. And, you know, patients dying because we're diagnosing them incorrectly because we're so tired. And the government was saying, oh yeah, but it takes ages to train up a doctor and, you know, it's going to cause us all sorts of problems. And ultimately the EU said, well, tough, that's your problem, okay? So this has always been, social policy has always been linked to free movement rights, because even in the Working Time Directive, the government was saying, well, we won't have time to train up doctors, and the EU was saying, well, you don't need to, you can import them from other countries. That's the whole point of free movement. So, right, so the Community Charter of Social Rights for Workers also kicked in about this time. Okay, and it was proposed by the Commission in 1989, and basically, from that moment on, social policy dialogue was directly linked to free movement. It always had been, but from that moment on, it was a very clear relationship between free movement rights and social policy. For one to work, you had to have the other. Right, so that was back in 1989. Okay, whilst the Social Charter was initially only a declaration of principles that applied to workers only, right, so it was limited just to workers, right, it was a very important step in the development of European social policy. Because for the very first time, social policy was elevated to the same level as economic matters in the European community. So there was a recognised correlation between the two. Okay? So the success of the single market was perceived as being dependent on social policy, which it is. Okay? Right, so the next treaty along was the Maastricht Treaty, okay, and the inclusion of the European Social Charter into the Maastricht Treaty was blocked by the British veto, right. The Social Charter was fought bitterly by Margaret Thatcher. She absolutely hated it. She was like, this is socialism by the back door over my dead body, we are not having this, right, so she vetoed it. So to that extent, it wasn't a wild success, but Maastricht had other very positive benefits as far as social policy was concerned. So, okay, they didn't win the Social Charter, but they did win some other things. Okay? One of them was the Commission was granted the power to create a dialogue between social partners. And this proved vital in actually creating a framework for European social policy negotiation. Suddenly, they could actually, if there was stuff that affected employment, they would be speaking to employment organisations, workers' rights, people like that. So they were starting to draw together all these different groups. Okay? Some areas of social policy were opened up to qualified majority voting, again, which opened up the whole system even more. This allowed for advance in policy by having a means of overcoming basically the constant deadlock that you had if you had a power of veto, and the veto, I have to say, was usually the UK. Right? When David Cameron sits there and says, oh, we're going to pull out the employment chapter, which is basically EU social policy. He's only carrying on a long tradition, right, of issues that the UK has with social policy. The French love social policy because they like being able to work 40 hours a week and go home and have their nice lunches and their 2-hour siesta and all the rest of it. Right, in the UK we're more used to working quite long hours, and so there is a very big cultural difference, which is one of the reasons why it causes political problems, even now. Right. Another key change was Article 13 of the Maastricht Treaty, and that, for the very first time, introduced, hang on, I think I've skipped one. Yeah, no, I haven't. Right. Some anti-discrimination provisions, right? So Article 13 of the Maastricht Treaty introduced a provision that you were not allowed to discriminate against people based on the grounds of sex, racial or ethnic origin, religion or belief, disability, age or sexual orientation. Okay, the reason for that is, have you covered European Convention on Human Rights? No? Okay. Human Rights Act? Yeah, you heard of it? Yeah. So a lot of that actually, because that was all going on in the wider environment, it had an impact on that. Okay? So suddenly it wasn't just limited to workers' rights and women and young people, but also individual groups. Disabled people, old people, people of a particular ethnic origin, people of a particular religion, people of a particular sex, right? Or sexual orientation. Okay? So this was quite a big change. Right, so this meant social policy was no longer limited to workers, but was extended to cover certain categories of people that needed protecting from certain types of discrimination. So that's one of the questions I think you've got in that you've got to answer for the seminar next week. Right, now, as you probably gathered, the European Court of Justice has been very, very active about helping to create the EU we have today. And when it comes to social policy, that's no different. Okay. For example, in the Treaty of Rome, they actually had some policy provisions, and the member states at that time had absolutely no intention that this was going to become something live. Right? Like it actually said in there, equal pay between men and women. Right? But the ECJ was not expected to take this seriously, so everyone was a bit shocked when they said, well, actually, we do. Okay? And member states had very different perspectives on this whole issue of equal treatment and equal pay. And the ECJ, by giving force to these dormant clauses in the treaty and by providing authoritative interpretations, the ECJ started to impose supranational harmonisation over nationally instituted welfare regimes. So the ECJ was very instrumental in actually developing the EU we have today. Also, social policy is great if you're working, right? All your rights that you have as an employee come from the EU. It comes from this policy, right? Equal pay, rights when you go off pregnant, the sort of questions you can be asked, the fact that you have a written contract, the fact that if they decide to vary your terms, they can't just change it and say, well, if you don't like it, tough, right? So the EU gets some things right and some things less right, like bendy bananas and all commission officials take Viagra according to the news of the world and that kind of thing, right? But when it comes to EU social policy, it very much gets it right. And this is something that most people can relate to. They might not understand that these rules come from Europe, but you still feel the benefit of them. Right? So, for example, right, the ECJ held that if you did equal work, you were entitled to equal pay between men and women. Okay, and that was the Dufresne case, which led to the creation of the Equal Pay Directive. And that was then extended to cover all employment conditions pertaining to the sexes, right? 1979 saw a directive enacted which intended to prevent the discrimination of workers from other EC countries and national social security systems. So there's a correlation in between non-discrimination and treating people the same. Okay. Right, another thing that you might have run across before is the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the Union. Okay, this is a bit of an odd one. Okay, they came up with this, right? They actually declared it in 2000. But then it wasn't really given legal effect until the Treaty of Lisbon, right? So that's quite a few years later. The UK and Poland opted out of it, so it doesn't really have much legal force in the UK. And the Czech Republic is trying to wriggle out of it. So it's a bit of, you know, technically it's enshrined, technically it has the same status as the treaties. In practice, it's kind of one of those, it looks nice and yes, okay, it's good to have it, but it's not much practical legal effect. In the UK, at least. In other countries, yes. Now, Maastricht introduced something else that was also really important, and that's this notion of EU citizenship. Whether you know it or not, are you all from the UK, or are any of you from anywhere else? Yeah? No? Right. So if you're a member of the European Union, so that's any country in Europe, you are automatically, as well as being a citizen of your own country, you're a citizen of the European Union. Right? And you have certain rights that go along with that. Okay? And that's an add-on. It doesn't replace your national citizenship because that stays no matter what, but it does actually go along with it. Okay? And it gives you additional rights. Now, one of the rights you have is you have the right, as a citizen of Europe, to move and reside freely within the EU. Now, this is quite a major change, because effectively what that means is now your free movement rights are not so much linked to social policy, but they're linked more to the fact that you're a citizen of Europe. Right? That is now the next phase that we're going on to. So in the beginning you had free movement and kind of a bit of a recognition that social policy was important. Then after 1987 you had this sort of general awareness that social policy and free movement went together. And then you've had the development of citizenship rights, and now free movement's much more linked to citizenship. Okay? So you've got a right to vote for and stand as a candidate in EU elections. When are the EU elections? May, yeah. You've the right to be protected by the diplomatic and consular authorities of any EU country. So if you get stranded abroad, right, you can go to the consular authorities, so the consulate of any EU country, and you should receive help as an EU citizen. You've the right to petition the European Parliament and complain to the European Ombudsman if the EU institutions aren't treating you properly. You've the right to contact an EU institution and receive a response in one of the EU's official languages. How many official languages are there? 3. No, altogether there's 23. I mean, the commonly used languages are English, French and German. But in terms of total number of official languages, then you're looking at about 23, 24. It used to be 23, but with Croatia joining, I'm guessing it's now 24. Okay. You have the right to access European Parliament, European Commission and Council documents. I have to say, the European Parliament's really good at that, the Commission is really good at that, the Council is absolutely rubbish. Okay, they're not very good at this, because they don't want people to see their political deliberations and hearing like David Cameron swearing at Angela Merkel and people like that. Okay, so they're not very good about reporting that kind of thing. Okay, the right of equal access to the EU civil service, and the treaty also prohibits discrimination on the grounds of nationality. Right, so you can actually find details of your citizens' rights on your Europe. So, let me see. Okay. So this is in all the different... Go away, I'll see you later. Alright. Okay. So if you click on that, right, this site is for you, the European citizen, and your family to know your rights and to find practical tips to help you move around the EU. Okay? So this covers everything that you need, like travel, like the documents you need. These are now seen as being citizenship rights. Okay, so this is a big shift away from workers' rights now to all of this lot. Okay, so travel, your passenger rights. Do you remember when there was the big volcano that went off in Iceland and none of the planes were flying? And there's passenger rights legislation that say if they cancel your flight, they have to put you up in a hotel and stuff like that. And a lot of the airlines weren't applying this because they were trying to say it was an act of God, right? So it didn't apply. There was actually a very funny film with Billy Connolly in, where he was a fisherman and his boat got hit by lightning, and the insurers denied the claim on the grounds it was an act of God. So he sued the church as God's representative to get his money back. Okay, so the choices that the church had was that they could either deny that they were God's representative, in which case what was the point of them being there, or they accepted liability, in which case every time insurers denied a claim on the basis it was an act of God, right, then they'd end up picking up the bill, neither of which was wildly appealing to them, amazingly enough. Okay, but yeah, but it's quite a good film. If you get the chance, it's worth a look, right? But on the basis that that doesn't apply, right, the EU's created passenger rights. Okay, what you can take with you, what you can bring back. Okay, the different money people use, safety. Also, looking for work abroad, right? As EU nationals, you have the right to look for work wherever you want, right? Anywhere in the EU, okay? I've done a lot of work in countries like Bulgaria and Romania, training up judges and prosecutors in EU law, for example, okay? So, cross-border commuting, right? Lots of people live in France, commute in Switzerland, commute out again, or work in Luxembourg and commute in, or whatever, okay? Working abroad as civil servant, general rules relating to workers, retiring, right? What you need in terms of driving licence, residence formalities. I mean, this all used to be students, if you want to go and study abroad, you obviously have the right to do that. Are you all familiar with the Erasmus programme? Yeah? So it gives you the opportunity to go and study in another member state. If you get the chance to, well worth it. I spent a year in France and it was absolutely brilliant. Education, health, family and consumer rights. Okay, so these are all now perceived as being part of your citizenship rights. Okay, so that's something that you can actually invoke as part of the fact that you are a citizen of Europe. Okay. Right. Now, sometimes you're going to run into situations where actually your citizens' rights are not being correctly applied. And Solve It is a really good organisation to know about, right? They basically deal with things like this, right? You've got qualifications already, and you're trying to go and work in another member state, and those qualifications not being recognised, right? Access to education, if you guys want to go and study in France or Germany or wherever, right, and for some reason the university is saying, no, you can't, you know, you're a British national, no. Right, residence permits, voting rights, social security, employment rights, driving licences, motor vehicle registration, border controls, market access for services as well as products, establishment of self-employed, public procurement, taxation, free movement. Okay, so this covers a lot of stuff that would ordinarily come under social policy. So what you do is you just contact them and say, I've got this problem, and what they do is they liaise with the public body that is causing the problem. Okay, and they negotiate a settlement for you. It's usually that actually the public authority does not understand what they're supposed to be doing, okay, or misapplying the law. So Solve It's a really good service, and it has the added benefit of being free. Okay. So if you have a problem enforcing your rights, they're the people that you go to help, basically. right? And Europe Direct is the organisation that I belong to, and we're basically there to inform people about their rights and how their rights work and stuff like that. Okay? So, any questions on EU social policy? I mean, is it something you've run across before or not? Did you know your employment rights came out of Europe? Yeah? Did you know you had employment rights? Okay. I mean, these are important things to be aware of, because basically if you know what your rights are, people cannot stitch you up. Okay, so I did say to you I'd actually have a look at the job side of things, right? Right. Are you familiar with that website, Euro Brussels? Heard of it? Right. They deal with jobs that have a European angle, right? And that can be on anything. So in terms of policy areas, right, you've got all of those. Okay, so agriculture, competition, consumers, customs, economic and monetary affairs, education, employment and social affairs, which is social policy. So what year are you in? Second, okay. So you're at the stage where jobs is something that isn't that far away, right? Well, this is a good place to go for if you want experience. So if you have a look for things like internships, right, this is where you go and you can kind of gain experience, right? You've got all sorts there. You've got Amnesty International, you've got a whole range of them, okay? All right, so a good place to go if you're looking for jobs in European affairs, okay? And it's very broad range, and there is actually a whole market out there of different jobs that people can get involved in. You know, getting involved in capacity building work, which is where you're helping to bring countries who are maybe less up to speed in either European law or just different ways of doing things, right? A lot of institutions are very focused on European law because it affects them in a substantial way. So they are always interested in tracking what is going on at EU level. Okay, and this is something you can all get involved in if you want. I mean, if you have a look at, say, EU Employment and Social Affairs, right? Okay, so there you go. Right, just what we've been covering today. Okay, so this stuff matters, and it can actually be stuff that earns you money. Okay, it's always good. You know, we don't live on air. So yeah, I mean that's basically a quick run through EU social affairs and social policy. So the main thing to bear in mind is you've got three distinct phases. You've got pre-1987 when nothing happened, 87 to about 2007 or 2000 roughly, right, when there was a growing awareness for EU social policy, right, and then post the Treaty of Lisbon where suddenly social policy, free movement and citizenship rights have all started to become connected. Okay, so three distinct phases, okay, and that's the thing to remember, right. Can you pass around a bit of paper? As you know, Anna's ill today. She's asked if I can just pass around a piece of paper and you can just put your name on so she knows who's been here. Okay. Right, and that's it. So, no, EU affairs. I mean, I've worked in EU affairs now for 10 years, 15 years. I did some work at the UN. And then I set up European Law Monitor 10 years ago, and we're based in Eastleigh, and then we became the local Europe Direct in 2006. So, you know, I spend my entire day basically doing stuff that has EU relevance. So you can get jobs like that. It doesn't have to be like a minor thing, yeah? So, did you have a question? Yeah, no, you. I thought you were putting your hand up. So, yeah. I mean, have you got any idea yet what area of work you want to get into? No? I mean, why are you doing the course then? I mean, there must be, you must have as a sort of end game that you wanted to get involved in European affairs in some way. Yeah.
Do you like legal work experience at your place in Eastleigh?
We do some. I mean, it's something I'm going to be talking over with Anna. So if you wanted to, maybe some of you wanted to just sort of help update the news, just to get a bit of a feel for EU affairs, I mean, I would be happy with that. I need to talk it over with Anna, but yeah, in principle, not a problem. And why? What sort of thing did you have in mind? Just sort of.
I do a lot of European studies, so I was just wondering if you did like any more law specific.
Well, yeah, because a lot of the queries I deal with are legal in focus. So yes, you know, I have had people sort of do some work experience, and they're looking more at the law side of things. So you know, people come up with questions, and then you know, you can help research them or whatever. Okay, but yeah, I mean that's something I'll talk over and see if Anna would be interested in doing something. So yeah, if you jot your name down, just sort of say I'd be interested, then I'll know who's asked the question. Okay, right. Okay, so I think we'll wrap up there. Yeah, sort of 1:45 or whatever. And you should find that when you're doing your seminar questions for next week, that most of this stuff should be relevant to it, okay? Well, anyway, thank you very much for your time, and hope you found it reasonably interesting. Okay, thank you.